Welcome back to lesson number 6. We're going to be talking about the history of the English Bible. Why do we use the Bible that we use right now? Well, follow along with me on your study sheet, and we're going to do more so reading in this lesson. And I just want you to get an idea of how we got the Bible that we're reading today. First of all, the entire Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language. The Jewish people are also called Hebrews. The New Testament was written in Greek because the language of the world under the first part of the Roman Empire was officially Greek. At that time, even the Jews spoke the Greek language. Now, the first Bible translation that we're going to look at is something called the Septuagint. The Septuagint. The Old Testament was translated into Greek before there ever was a New Testament. Immediately preceding the Christian era, in the middle of the 3rd century BC, a group of scholars was commissioned by the high priest of Jerusalem to translate the holy writings in Greek. The work was called the Septuagint, which means 70, so named because of the 70 scholars who did the translation. Roman numeral LXX sometimes abbreviates Septuagint. Next, there was something called the Vulgate. Around 340 to 420 AD, when the Greek language was replaced by the Latin language, the scholar Jerome translated the Bible to Latin, the official language of the Roman Empire. This Bible became the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. So we'll need to make sure that we take a note of the one that is called, or the translation that is called, the Vulgate. It was the first Bible that was used or actually translated into, let's skip that part. Next, John Wycliffe. Great Britain established Christianity in the 7th century. At first, all Bibles were in Latin and handwritten. The first English version of the entire Bible was associated with the work of John Wycliffe, 1320 to 1384. It was translated from the Latin Vulgate. The one thing I want you to really remember concerning John Wycliffe, this great the one thing I want you to remember about John Wycliffe is his name. His last name starts with a W, and the Bible translations that he did were handwritten. So think about the first letter of the word writing and the first letter of his last name, which is Wycliffe. So that's very important. Why? Because when people were translating scriptures during that time, there were no typewriters, there was no computers, nothing along that line. No, they actually had to use ink and writing them with their own hands. And my understanding is if they made a mistake, they would have to start all over again because they believed that these scriptures that they were writing were very sacred. So these monks who were doing the translations and the writing of the scriptures, they had to do it very carefully not to make a mistake. Next, William Tyndale, from 1490 to 1536. He was imprisoned and executed by strangulation when he began to distribute printed versions of the New Testament to the common people. Before he could finish the printing and distribution of the entire Old Testament, he was killed. Well, this lets you know that there were people who were very passionate about getting the Bible into the hands of common people. And as they were trying to get the Bible in the hands of the common people, it was against the law. And so they were put to death. And William Tyndale was one who was imprisoned and put to death because he wanted to get the Bible in the hands of the average common person. Now, what I'm looking at here to help you to remember or to distinguish between Wycliffe and Tyndale is their last names. And so William Tyndale, his last name starts with a T, and so does the word type. And we know now that the printing press had come into has been invented during his time, and so he started printing versions of the New Testament. And so this is very important. T.Y. Tyndale and T.Y. for type. Even though they weren't typing with a typewriter, they used the printing press to print these New Testaments. And so we just want you to remember the name Tyndale and type, because it was now a printed version of the New Testament. We move on to Miles Coverdale. In 1488, 1568, he was the first to complete a printed translation of the entire Bible in English. He translated it from the Latin Vulgate. Now, Miles Coverdale is very important because now we see that he covers the entire Bible. The Old and the New Testament is now printed. So I see the first letters in his name, C-O-V, cover, C-O-V-E-R, cover. And so he covered the Old and New Testament. These were the first printed versions of the English Bibles with the whole Old Testament and New Testament in the printed copies. All right. Next, we go to Queen Mary of England. What happened with her? Well, when Mary came to the throne in 1553, she banned Bible translations. She had Miles Coverdale placed in prison. However, the work managed to continue. He had placed the books of the Apocrypha between the Old and New Testaments. The Apocrypha, of course, those are basically Jewish history books. Queen Mary actually put to death Miles Coverdale and many others, I'm sure, during that time. But her name, Mary, has been given, was the name that was given to a drink called the Bloody Mary. Well, it was because Mary wanted to ban the Bible translations and did not want Bibles in the hands of the common people. So there were people who suffered and died because they were so passionate about getting the Bible in the hands of the common people in England. And so Mary was one of the people, in government. She was a queen, and so she was trying to ban this because there were people who just did not want the average person to know God's word. And so what would be the problem there? The same thing it was with the Pharisees in the days of Jesus. There are actually people who feel like they should have supreme authority, and they figure if anyone knows anything about God, that they will have to learn from the priest or holy people. So that was one of the things that was going on in those days, and many people gave their lives to get the gospel out. Next, we look at something called the Great Bible. Around 1539, after a period, the Great Bible appeared. It was a Bible for the congregation to read on a stand in the churches. It had large print and looked like the large pulpit Bibles we see today. Several scholars did this work. So the Great Bible is something that we'll need to remember because it was then the Bible that the common people could read. They couldn't have their own Bible at their homes, but they could come and see a printed version of the English Bible at church. So the church doors would be open and people could actually go into the churches and read from this Bible. Later on, in 1560, there was the Geneva Bible. This was the first Bible with both chapter and verse division. Next, the Bishop's Bible, 1568, the first Bible in England after the banning during the reign of Queen Mary. Queen Elizabeth ordered a pulpit-style Bible on the lecterns of all churches. The Bishop's Bible later replaced the Great Bible. So, the reason I believe the Bishop's Bible replaced the Great Bible is because now that the Geneva Bible has come about, there's a such thing as chapter and verse division. So, can you imagine reading a Bible right now and you don't know where to turn when there was no such thing as turn to John 3:16? But later, because of the Geneva Bible, the Bible was then divided into chapters and verses, and you could turn and you could read the 23rd Psalm and you knew how to find it. All right? So when the Bishop's Bible came along, it was placed on the pulpit lecterns, and people could go and they could find the scriptures that they were looking for just by looking at the chapters and verses. In 1609, the Dewey Bible, it was the first Roman Catholic Bible printed in English. So all this time, they used the Latin Bible or the Vulgate. And so now there's an English version of the Bible, and it is for the Roman Catholics. And this one is called the Dewey Bible, 1609. King James Version came about in 1611. When James I came to the throne in 1603, James called a meeting at Hampton Court to discuss religious toleration. The Puritans protested against what they thought were mistranslations in the Bishop's Bible, and they also preferred the Geneva Bible, thereby antagonizing the Anglicans. The king took steps to begin a new version. The work was to be done by a large number of English scholars, 60 to be exact. The work that did not actually begin until 1607, and in 1611 the first edition of the King James Bible appeared. This group effort resulted in a sacred and literary masterpiece, a work that soon became the Bible to English-speaking Protestants everywhere. The King James Bible measured all subsequent translations. The translators were not dependent upon the Latin Vulgate alone for the text. Both Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament manuscripts were available to them. The aim of the scholars was a concise, accurate, and polished translation that would be readily understood by readers of that day. This was a period when English literature was blooming, and the Jacobean Elizabethan English was being developed into a magnificent medium of expression for simple nobility of language, for beautiful cadence, for sublime expression of poetic ideas. The King James Version of the Bible has never been surpassed. That's from the Holy Bible, copyright 1962 by Thomas Nelson, Incorporated. We also know about the revision of the King James Bible. The 1611 version was revised in 1709, and most likely the Bible that we read today that we call the King James Bible is the revised version of 1709. What is a revision? Well, when we talk about a revision, that means to return to vision. Revision means to return to vision. It was rewritten for clarity when the English language started to reform in later years. The closest writing to the original would be the most accurate. And that is the reason why we use the King James Bible primarily for studying. There are other versions that we will read, but as far as studying the Bible, it's good to study the King James because of the wording there. They are closer to the most accurate words from the original, because the translators actually had access to the original writings. understand that there was a time when the scriptures, the original scriptures, were lost for a long period of time, and they were not discovered until the 1940s when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And so before that time, just before that time, years had gone by, and the only Bible that was preserved was the English Bible. And I believe that God used those translators to translate the Bible in English from the original, because they found the original scripts and they used those to translate word for word. And so the Bible was then preserved in the English language. And from the English language, it was then translated to many other languages around the world. Well, during that time, the original scripts were lost, or at least hidden, for many, many years, and no one had the original until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And once the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, then I realized that there were people who took the King James Version of the Bible and they began to look at how it was word for word translated directly from the original Hebrew and to English, and from the original Greek into English. And that again is the reason why I believe it is best to study from the King James Version of the Bible, because right now it is the closest thing to the original that we have.